In this guide, we'll go over all of the actions that Dark Knight learns from level 50 to 90 in order. We'll go over how each action is meant to be used and when applicable, the recommended way to use it. We will also summarize changes to the rotation at level 60, 70 and 80. In the summary, we'll take time to outline both an opener and general rotation, as well as stat priorities. Please be aware that this guide assumes you have some preliminary knowledge as listed here. Relevant videos can be found in the description or the top right corner. Now then, at level 52, you learn the ability Salted Earth. This does a decent amount of damage in the area around you over its duration. Make sure to use it on cooldown, weaving it between your GCDs. To introduce an opener, weave Edge of Darkness and then Blood Weapon after your first GCD, and then weave Salted Earth after the second. We will build on this opener throughout the guide as a way to build a priority order of your cooldowns and resources. At level 54, you learn the ability Plunge, which works as a gap closing ability. It has a very short cooldown, so you can use it just for the damage if you won't need the mobility. Keep in mind that it is far more valuable for movement if you do find that you might need it. If you plan to use it for damage, weave it after Salted Earth in your opener and use it on cooldown. At level 56, you learn the ability Abyssal Drain, an AoE attack that both heals you for each target hit and recovers 600 mana. For an opener, weave it after Salted Earth and move Plunge to after your third GCD. On AoE, Abyssal Drain's value increases immensely, but since most of your oGCDs preceding it also scale with the number of targets, this does not change your priority. When doing large dungeon pulls, it may also be beneficial to delay the use of Abyssal Drain to use it for the healing effect when you can benefit more from it. At level 60, you learn the ability Carve and Spit, which is an alternative option to Abyssal Drain, as they share cooldown. Carve and Spit does far more single target damage and should be used over Abyssal Drain on up to 3 targets. Carve and Spit also recovers 600 mana, but does not heal you. At this level, Carve and Spit can be prioritized over Salted Earth on 1 or 2 targets. However, in the interest of learning muscle memory, it may be better to use Carve and Spit interchangeably with Abyssal Drain. Since level 50, you have added a bunch of oGCD options to your arsenal. To outline an opener example, do your 1-2-3 combo, weaving Edge of Darkness with Blood Weapon after Heart Slash, Salted Earth with Carve and Spit after Siphon Strike, and Edge of Darkness with Plunge after Soul Eater. Here is listed a priority list of your oGCDs, which should align with the opener. At level 62, you unlock the Blood Gauge. Soul Eater will from now on generate 20 Blood Gauge on use, and you can accumulate up to 100 Blood Gauge. You also learn Blood Spiller, a heavy-hitting weapon skill that spends 50 Blood Gauge. You should simply use Blood Spiller when able, although if you are in a team composition where other players can boost your damage, you could keep Blood Gauge to time the spending with the damage buffs. Don't sit on 100 Blood Gauge. If you have 100 Blood Gauge and your next action will generate more, make sure to use Blood Spiller first. Keep in mind that Blood Spiller does not break your basic 1-2-3 combo. At level 64, you learn the weapon skill Quietus. This functions as an AoE alternative to Blood Spiller, beating it on 3 or more targets. A very significant property of Quietus is that it is a weapon skill, meaning it scales with your skill speed, compared to Unleash, which scales with spell speed. Because of this, it is more likely for you to be able to fit the limit of 5 GCDs in Blood Weapon when using Quietus than when using Unleash. Keep this in mind for later, as at this level you can at best fit 2 Quietus in the 10-second Blood Weapon window, which is not enough for the skill speed factor to help. At level 66, Blood Weapon is upgraded to also generate 10 Blood Gauge per action. This does not change your rotation, but keep it in mind if you're using Blood Weapon while at high amounts of Blood Gauge. At level 68, you learn the ability Delirium, which gives you 3 charges for 15 seconds that makes Blood Spiller and Quietus free. It also causes Blood Spiller to recover 200 mana and Quietus to recover 500 mana. You can use Delirium early and then use the free casts when it is convenient. However, keep in mind that it will take around 6 seconds to use the charges. Delirium should be used on cooldown of course, and should be high priority. Delirium also introduces a trick to fit 5 GCDs in Blood Weapon on AoE. You need a minimum of 60 Blood Gauge to do it. Activate Delirium at some point, then, as your late weave Blood Weapon, you now should have enough Blood Gauge and Delirium stacks to use 4 Quietus attacks in a row, which, due to Blood Weapon, will grant you 40 more Blood Gauge, bringing you from 10 to 50 at the end, allowing you to use one final Quietus. Because of the cooldowns of Delirium and Blood Weapon being identical, you can do this for every Blood Weapon. Remember that you need at least a GCD of 2.43 to fit 5 GCDs in Blood Weapon. If you prefer a more relaxed experience, I would recommend 2.38 or anything between these two numbers. At this level, generating Blood Gauge on AoE outside of Blood Weapon itself is not really possible. However, if you can only do 4 Quietus, make sure Unleash is the last of the 5 GCDs, as this should enable you to fit 5 GCDs in the Blood Weapon window. For your opener, you can now start with Delirium and replace the first 3 GCDs with Bloodspiller. On AoE, I would recommend using Unleash on the first GCD such that all the Quietus come after Blood Weapon. At level 70, you learn the ability The Blackest Night. This ability is commonly known by its acronym TBN. On a very short cooldown, it applies a massive shield to the target of your choice, often yourself. It costs just as much as an Edge of Darkness or Flood of Darkness, but if the shield is spent from damage, it grants you Dark Arts, a buff with no duration that allows you to cast one use of either Edge or Flood of Darkness for free, effectively paying its cost back. At this point, you should always try to keep at least 3000 mana available for TBN, and if Darkside has plenty of duration left, you should prioritize preventing damage with TBN over dealing damage with Flood or Edge of Darkness. In a coordinated raid team, you can make use of accumulating a Dark Arts stack to bring an extra 3000 mana into a burst window with raid cooldowns up if you wish. This trick can be very difficult and is not expected in regular play. Keep in mind that the shield's size is based on the target's health, so if you apply the shield to a player with less max health, it is more likely to break, returning the mana. Since level 60, the Blood Gauge and Delirium has been introduced. For your opener, use Delirium just before combat starts, which leads into 3 Bloodspillers and an otherwise unchanged oGCD order. For AoE, clever use of Delirium and Quietus around Blood Weapon can enable you to fit 5 GCDs in the Blood Weapon window, even on AoE. TBN is also introduced as an incredibly powerful tool for blunting damage. Make sure to use it on incoming tank busters, and on large AoE packs, simply use TBN on cooldown to prevent as much damage as you can. Combining TBN with a damage reduction cooldown can make tank busters trivial to manage. At level 72, you learn the spell Stalwart Soul. This functions as the step 2 to your Unleash, and Stalwart Soul both grants 600 mana just like Siphon Strike, and 20 Blood Gauge like Soul Eater. This makes your AoE combo far superior at resource generation. For this reason, even if the actual damage from the AoE combo is lower on 2 targets, the resource generation causes you to be able to use Flood of Darkness more often, as well as Bloodspiller. This means that on 2 or more targets, you should use this new 1-2 AoE combo in place of your 1-2-3 combo. This also makes it much easier to have the necessary Blood Gauge to perform 4 or 5 Quietus for the Blood Weapon window. At level 74, Flood of Darkness and Edge of Darkness are upgraded to Flood of Shadow and Edge of Shadow respectively. This does not change your rotation at all. At level 76, you learn the ability Dark Missionary, which is a raid-wide magic damage reduction effect on a moderate cooldown. If you see the boss use an attack that looks or sounds like raid-wide AoE damage, try and use it, as raid-wide damage is more commonly likely to be magic than physical. It is better to use Dark Missionary on something it doesn't work on than miss the opportunity to use it on something it would have worked on, so experiment. At level 78, Plunge gets an extra charge. This does not change how you use it, although it does mean you can use 1 Plunge in your opener and still have 1 for mobility. If you want to use both for damage in the opener, weave the second Plunge once you have gone through all your other options. At level 80, you learn the ability Living Shadow. This, at the cost of 50 Blood Gauge, summons a good friend to attack for you for a while. This should be used on cooldown and should be prioritized over all your other oGCD options if possible, since the cost of Blood Gauge can sometimes hamper that. Living Shadow is still worth using on AoE, but keep in mind you need at least 4 Quietus to manage 5 GCDs in Blood Weapon. Since level 70, your AoE combo has been upgraded so much that it beats your single target combo on 2 or more targets. The only other significant change is the introduction of Living Shadow. The importance of using Living Shadow early in a fight requires some adjustments to the opener. Start by using TPN 2 seconds before pulling, and just before you plan to attack, use Blood Weapon, so about half a second before, and then use Hard Slash. Weave Edge of Shadow and Delirium, then use Siphon Strike weaving Salted Earth and Carbon Spit. Then use Soul Eater and weave Living Shadow alongside Plunge. After that, start using Blood Spiller and weave any remaining oGCDs. Keep in mind, if you're not the main tank, you can use TPN on the other tank instead. The purpose is to spend mana so the first GCD with Blood Weapon isn't going to waste. At level 82, you learn the ability Oblation, a decent damage reduction option with 2 charges and a minute cooldown. Its power mostly comes from combining it with TPN to make the value of the shield greater. A measly 10% damage reduction is worth a lot more when combined with a 25% health shield. You can also use Oblation to play for time between other defensive cooldowns. I would advise that you find reason to use at least 1 charge quickly such that the cooldown is started. Keep in mind that this can be used on other players too. At level 84, your 1-2-3 combos potencies are increased. Additionally, using Unmend reduces the cooldown of Plunge. Neither of these effects change your rotation in any significant way. Do keep in mind that in Endwalker, using Unmend no longer cancels your combo. At level 86, you learn the ability Salt and Darkness. When you use Salted Earth, the button is replaced with Salt and Darkness, and it causes the area that Salted Earth covers to burst for massive damage. Naturally, this should be used for every Salted Earth, but in an opener, this takes priority below other oGCDs, unless Salted Earth is about to end, in which case it should have the highest priority. Due to the power of Salt and Darkness, Salted Earth should be prioritized over Carbon Spit in general. Just to be absolutely clear, Salted Earth is prioritized highly, but Salt and Darkness is prioritized much lower because it does not affect the cooldown of Salted Earth, as long as it is cast before Salted Earth ends. At level 88, Living Shadow gains a damage boost, making it even stronger. This does not change your rotation. At level 90, you and your Living Shadow learn the ability Shadowbringer. With up to 2 charges and a minute cooldown, this attack does a monstrous amount of damage, doing half the damage to all other targets than the main one. For some reason, it is a requirement that Darkside is active to use this. This ability should be prioritized over Carbon Spit in your long list of oGCDs. Due to the very long cooldown to generate both charges, you can use these once every 60 seconds or keep both charges together for a larger burst. In a coordinated raid team, keeping them closer together for a big burst every 2 minutes will be far superior to using them alone. To round off, let's look at your attack rotation, starting with an opener example, followed by general rotation including AoE adjustments, and finishing off with stat priorities. If you are the main tank, make sure Grit is active. Then, 2 seconds before pulling, cast TPN and use Blood Weapon half a second before pulling, effectively just before Hard Slash. After Hard Slash, weave Edge of Shadow and Delirium. Then use Siphon Strike, and if you plan to use a tincture, a so-called burst potion, weave it here. Then use Soul Eater and weave Living Shadow and Salted Earth. Then Hard Slash and weave Shadowbringer and Edge of Shadow. Now use Blood Spiller and weave Carbon Spit and Plunge. Another Blood Spiller and weave another Shadowbringer and Edge of Shadow. Yet another Blood Spiller and weave Salt and Darkness and Edge of Shadow again. Finish with Siphon Strike, and now you can choose to weave Plunge again if you won't need the mobility, and Edge of Shadow if you know you won't need the mana immediately for TPN. Take note that if the fight will cause the targets to move out of Salted Earth before Salt and Darkness, you may want to adjust your opener to delay Salted Earth until the enemies will actually stay in it. This then leads into the general rotation. Make sure that Blood Weapon is always late weaved to make your chances of fitting 5 GCDs in it as high as possible. Use Delirium on cooldown and fit the 3 free blood gauge attacks within the time limit. Since Blood Weapon and Delirium have the same cooldown length, you can sort of combine them, which is particularly useful and important for AoE, as it is what enables you to fit 5 GCDs in the Blood Weapon window. Be aware that during Delirium, spending blood gauge can be difficult. Edge of Shadow should be used regularly enough that the dark side buff is always active, and if you have dark arts and plan to use TPN, use Edge of Shadow sooner rather than later. If dark side has plenty of duration, it should be a higher priority to use TPN than Edge of Shadow, as the damage you can prevent is worth more than the damage you could do instead. In fact, in most cases, TPN will grant a free Edge of Shadow anyway. Make sure all of the other damage cooldowns gets used, and when they overlap, here is a priority list. For 2 targets, you should replace your 1-2-3 combo with your 1-2 AoE combo of Unleash and Stalwart Soul. When using Blood Weapon, you may want to use your 1-2-3 combo instead if you do not have the blood gauge to use 5 Blood Spiller in a row. For 3 or more targets, Blood Spiller should be replaced by Quietus, and Edge of Shadow should be replaced by Flood of Shadow. At this point, it is important to try and plan your blood weapon usage in such a way that Delirium is ready along with 60 blood gauge to fit 5 Quietus in a row. With just 20 blood gauge, you can also do 4 Quietus in a row, finishing with either Unleash or Stalwart Soul. For 4 or more targets, replace Carbon Spit with Abyssal Drain. All of your other oGCD options can and should be used on cooldown regardless of number of targets. Finally, regarding stat priorities. In almost every single case, item level is more important than the correct secondary stats, so always pick the gear piece with the higher item level and thus most strength on it. After that, Dark Knights, like most jobs, really like critical hit. As a second priority, go for skill speed until you reach the GCD amount you prefer. Remember, the main concern is to fit 5 GCDs in Blood Weapon. This can be done with as slow as 2.43, but even as fast as 2.38 is perfectly fine and makes it far more comfier if you prefer this. After this, Dark Knights want Direct Hit and then Determination. These 2 stats are almost identical in value, but because tanks never find Direct Hit on their gear, they tend to scale better with it when you choose to meld it. Finally comes Tenacity, which has a similar effect to Determination, although it scales worse. Tenacity also reduces all damage taken, but this part scales too poorly to ever become significant. Do remember that you do not need to have the best stats on your gear for most content in the game, as long as the item level matches the challenge. If you do want to have the best, I would advise you to seek out communities focused on these aspects. That is all for this video. Thank you for watching. If you have any questions or maybe a story of saving a friend with TPN, then please leave a comment down below. Fun fact, Reprisal used to be a Dark Knight exclusive action that could only be used after parrying an attack. It only reduced the damage done by the specific target, however.